Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Glenn McKnight, and I'm here with Alfredo Calderon, our dean for the school, as well as one of our advisors, Bill Juris. And we have a distinguished guest today to talk about actors, our module that is one of the most, I think, Alfredo, would you say one of the most elaborate sessions we have? It's an extensive session, and we gave the task to Jothan to tackle this task of trying to make sense of it. So let me just take a quick second here and pull up the slideshow. Just bear with me for a second. And Okay. Okay, folks, this is our weekly call. All these sessions are recorded, and if you're interested in seeing previous recordings, all the recordings are available in the YouTube playlist. In this case, it's the playlist for Group H. We will be reserving 15 minutes into the session, or 10 minutes or so, depending on how things go, for any questions. So please also, throughout the session, Alfredo and myself will read out any questions that are pertinent to the slide or what Jothan is talking about. And lastly is we would really do appreciate you take the time to complete the survey. And Jothan, I've done the correction already on the form. Okay, I'd like to do a call out to our sponsors. These are our sponsors that have generously supported us to keep our program free and available. Okay, I just want to do a call out for our next session. Next Monday, Matthew Shears. Some of you may know Matthew as a ICANN board member, deeply involved with NCUC. He's going to go into the woods, or the weeds, as they said, on infrastructure for next week. So moving forward. Okay, here he is. Let me just pull up my written material. Okay, Jothan is the RRSG Executive Committee Vice Chair. Hilton has been elected as the Vice Chair, Technical Operations of the Registrar Stakeholder Group as of June 2020, and has been re-elected for 2022. Jothan also is co-chair of the CPH Tech Ops and RRSG rep to the GNSO Standing Selection Committee. I just have to tell folks, please open up your ICANN glossary of terms, because these are all short forms. So please have those ready in reference back to these. He's also held a variety of senior executive roles with registries and registrars since first working with the domains in 1991. So tell me, Jonathan, were you about 14 years old when you started this? 14, 15?
You know, I may look it, but no, sir.
Currently, he's the owner and the CEO of Blisk. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Blisk.com, known for his enthusiasm for domain names and our industry, his work on the public suffix list of PSL, and being a co-founder of NamesCon. His term concludes in the GM in 2024. Thank you. And let me go back to slides. Okay, thank you. And over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And so I kind of took your, so thank you for the warm introduction and for the opportunity and privilege to be here today. I certainly appreciate what you're doing with this initiative to educate. And so thank you. So I took you literally on actors, and I think it's a good opportunity because my name, and I think it's why I love names so much and domain names as a sort of a moniker, is my name gets confused a lot with an actor, a literal actor named Jonathan Frakes, who plays Riker in Star Trek: The Next Generation and a number of other sort of Star Trek related films and television shows. So I'm on the left on this slide, and on the right is an actual actor, Jonathan Frakes. Next slide, please. But to kind of get a bit more literal, I want to talk about actors in the discussion and really kind of explain a little bit of the commercial marketplace because of the exposure that I have as an ICANN accredited registrar. And with my background in registries and registrars, as well as doing conferences in the space, I'm exposed a lot to what I would call a boardroom conversation with people not familiar with our industry. And so I'm going to take some time and explain, what our industry is, kind of the different segments of the industry, how they tie into internet governance, and some of the current issues that we're trying to tackle with respect to internet governance as we go. So I want to start off with what I call the unspoken realities of domain names. Within the world of registrars, we're often the very first place that a person starts to engage with or create or operate a domain name. And there's some realities as people start to engage with domain names that those of us in the industry often overlook, but we need to keep in the forefront of our mind, is that every person's perspective on how they want to engage with or create or interact with domains is different. I gave a few different examples, but the most frequent one, and the one we like to see all the time, is when an entrepreneur comes up with a great idea to launch a new product or service, they go and register a domain name. And they're really focused on what their objective is, which is to make sure that their store is found. We saw a lot of that during the pandemic, where there was a higher number of registrations because people were speeding to launch some form of a web presence that they had as a deferred project. There's also corporate examples. I think it's important to recognize that a corporate user might be different, that they may be protecting the brand, perhaps even seeking to interact with an existing registrant of a domain name. And they care a lot about infringement and protecting their intellectual property rights. So they may have an entirely different way that they interact with domain names than their registrar. Either they're proactively registering domain names to help their brand be reinforced, or sometimes they're reacting to a third party registering a domain that's potentially infringing. And then just general internet users, when they go and they're trying to interact with, find, or do something online, domain names are interacted with constantly. And domain names literally are the internet. You can't really have any kind of effective interaction with the internet without domains. So I think they're a fantastic technology. And one of the things that go beyond just typing a domain name when you're working with them is that there's nuances to how the industry is structured, and how you contact a registrant or work with a registrar can have, I think, some educational hurdles. Part of why I was so delighted to interact with this audience here is that the educational hurdle can often really have a profound effect on the quality of the interaction somebody has with domain names. But as someone learns how you interact with a domain name, there can be a large educational hurdle, and this can often take a little while before somebody realizes how I'm going to interact with the domain name. For example, go register a domain with a registrar, find a domain that is available if the one that they choose is taken. Sometimes people are reacting to somebody else having the domain name that they had, in mind. So you may have some kind of visceral period, heightened emotional discussions. But ultimately, we hope that there are good interactions. And we often are starting to see, and I'll cover this a little bit later, but some places where governance is, where internet governance is being done legislatively in a lot of geographies. And those often take no consideration or understanding of how the actual technology works, and create some really challenging effects inside of the industry. So typically users are a bit confused. A lot of the times it has to do with some of the manner in which our industry operates. So I'll cover a little bit about that, but definitely, it's important to note that registrants here, as an example, may not opt to use privacy. They may choose to show their registration results and contact information publicly. And one of the things that's happening very frequently is that folks receive solicitations from outside of their interest level, so they get spam or marketing coming to them. If you're not familiar with how domain names work, you might accidentally click on something either in an SMS message or in an email for something that looks like the domain you're trying to interact with. And there's often new technologies that are emerging that aren't even really domain names that are starting to emerge in the Web3 space that unless you're looking closely, might look like a fantastic investment opportunity or engagement opportunity that may or may not be something that actually work. So it's important to understand the nuances of the domain name industry. And I'm covering a lot in this particular slide, but I'll break it out a little bit more in subsequent slides. So I apologize if I just jump right in with a lot of meat here. If you'll go to the next slide, the domain name business, I talked about this, it's super exciting. When we in the domain industry talk about domain names, we get super excited about it. But as I noted, people have their own level of interest and objective with domain names, but you can't interact with the internet really without domain names. And it's truly a front door to online businesses. It is your identity in many cases and your agency that you control and manage as a registrant. As far as our industry goes, and I'll talk a little bit about this, there's hundreds of registrars globally, all around the world. And there's hundreds of registries, top-level domains. So you can choose your local CCTLD, you can choose from any of a number of hundreds of top-level domains in the generic space, whether it's .com or .org. You could select from any of domain name spaces like shop. I can pull them out of the air, but I often pick .horse as an example. There's a variety of top-level domains that are available in the GTLD space. It's an industry where billions of dollars are exchanging hands, whether they're in the primary or secondary market, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But emerging economies, I see, within this educational program that there's a tremendous number of participants from Ghana. And throughout Africa, there's just transformational change happening with respect to growth and opportunity. And that's true where internet exposure and internet expansion is creating opportunities. So you see economies emerging and growing on the internet. But there is a robust secondary marketplace. Domain names can be hand registered, but there's often domains that have been because they are first come, first serve, and each is unique and distinct. Sometimes those domains are trading hands for hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, and even tens of millions of dollars for an individual domain name. So there's an entire ecosphere. Just I'm going to talk about registries and registrars here, but there's also all kinds of additional services built on that help facilitate things like that. Transactional escrow services, domain auctions, and brokerages. Next slide, please, Glenn. So I'm going to focus back on the actors and institutions just to give a big overview of what the domain name shared registration system looks like with respect to ICANN. Next slide, please. So I really split this into two different areas. And it really helps when you think of the domain name system two different ways. So one is domain name registrations, and the other is domain name resolution. If you split those off, it makes it much more simplified to think in terms of what the system works like. So in the registration systems, this is where you have domains, contacts, and host records that you can manage at a domain name registrar. And those registrars, and I do mention that sometimes you may interact with a reseller, those registrars manage those resources at registries. On the DNS side, I often refer to this as kind of the broadcast, but this is the system that converts domain names into server addresses so that internet visitors arrive at what they hope to arrive at. These are just the configurations that resolve domain names to an IP address, MX record, or other resource. And that resolution side is often hosted with a third party rather than the registrar or reseller. It's an important note, and I will clap back to this later in the presentation. So next slide, please. So the registrar business profiles are interesting. Many of you or any registrant are going to interact with an ICANN accredited registrar for GTLDs, but there's different profiles of business and objectives that you may have, and different registrars have different profiles. I'm listing just 5 of these. There are probably more, and these sometimes one or more of these attributes can be present at an ICANN accredited registrar. There's general consumer registrar, where you just go to get a domain name. Sometimes that service might be paired with hosting or some other form of service, like internet service. You also have companies that do brand management or corporate registration services. Additionally, there's bulk and wholesale consumer type registrars, and then a type that doesn't actually engage directly with registrars, or sorry, with registrants, but rather provides some form of a API that can be integrated into other services and systems. Now, there's many different models. And there's 2 kind of key things here is that, a consumer or end user, they're often more sensitive to pricing. And then corporates are more sensitive to service and less sensitive to pricing. Next slide, please. So here's a way to kind of visualize the different strata. The top row is the top level domain. And I'd use .com as an example. It's operated by VeriSign. And the best way I've found to describe to boardrooms or to 5-year-olds or to people who aren't in our business at all is to describe the top level domain registry as the manufacturer. The supply chain seems to work as a good model for that. Next comes the ICANN accredited registrar. And so GoDaddy would be an example of this. Plisk, my company, would be an example of this, or Namecheap, Namebright, or a variety of different ICANN accredited registrars globally. I often refer to this as the store. Now, I also say that there are optionally sometimes a level of resellers in between, whether they're API based or some form of affiliated reseller. In this case, that's the store because it's who the actual end user registrant is going to interact with. And so when the case where you're working through a reseller, it might help to think of the store or registrar that's providing those services to think of that as a distributor, and ultimately the reseller is the store. And then ultimately the domain registrant, I think the most important of these is that natural or legal person who is the customer. And if you think of it in those layers, it really helps to simplify and understand all of the different players in the domain registration channel. Can you come to the next slide, please, Glenn? I'll give you some interesting, this is additional information, but again, I will refer back to this later in the presentation. And these are based off of 2022 figures. So if you're looking at this in the future, this may not seem to match what stats say. It's just based off of some anecdotal 2022 information. But some facts. It costs a lot of money for a registrar to market, advertise, and onboard new customers. New customers on average can cost between 25 to 35 US dollars to acquire. And the margin on a 1 year of a domain name typically averages $1 to $2. So you've got an average time to recover that cost of acquisition can span, sometimes 10 to 13 years. When a registrar receives a support call, it can cost up to 10 years margin on a domain registration. So we really work to be excellent and to ensure those are very efficient interactions and make sure that that's a very good interaction that registrants have with the registrar. And now I described that, and why are there so many registrars? Well, they don't just sell domain names. Typically, registrars are some form of a gateway into other things that connect and pair very well with domain names, such as SSL certificates, that little lock that you see in your browser. Often there's some form of need for hosting, perhaps email services, like Microsoft 365 or G Suite, or things, maybe even an email service that the registrar operates. So those things are often an annual subscription or monthly subscription that tie to the domain name. And those are the actual area that a registrar might make money. One interesting data point there is that registrants who do activate some form of service, they're typically almost 12 times more likely to renew that domain name. So it's a much higher rate of renewals with the registrants who do that. And most registrants, they'll activate the services either in the first 2 weeks of a registration, or they'll activate it in the last 2 weeks of a registration right before they renew, typically based upon notice. That second part in the last 2 weeks was a very big surprise to me, but it makes sense. Typically a renewal notice will come to a registrant and they're like, oh yeah, I need to do something with that. Next slide, please.
I was going to, I noticed your last comment. It reminds me of gym memberships. People start very eager in the in January after the feasting, and then near the end of their contract, they or whatever, they jump back in again. So it seems to replicate that.
Yeah, I think they want to extract they want to use the last of the cheese before it expires, perhaps. Next slide. So this is another thing I'm going to call back to later, but I call it the Internet of Stuff. And I use the word stuff very liberally here, and it's meant to be a catch-all for quite a number of things. But domain name stuff, we're looking at the domain name system of GTLD domain names and GTLD registrations that will fall under ICANN's purview, which I'll talk about a little bit in a few slides. So there's the Internet of Stuff, but really the domain name is just going to kind of direct you to stuff. The thing I have here in blue in the right column is, okay, you've got a domain name, and where do you point it? What does it do? So this is, internet service providers, web hosting, cloud service, and CDN, edge providers, email. Can be social media and social media handles. It can be social media or software as a service, or other things as a service, and other infrastructure that you point your domain name to. And these can overlap. So I'm going to describe these later as being things that fall outside of the things that are within ICANN's regulatory purview. But I will say that the profiles can vary on registrars. Some registrars do offer some of the services on the right, while many don't. And so that is that creates some interesting situations, because you can really only control the things that are under your own realm. And I'll describe that in just coming up. So park that idea. But hopefully this helps you see the domain name stuff that's happening inside of ICANN's world, and then the other stuff that's happening outside of ICANN's world, mostly. That's why I made that conditional reference. Next slide, please. So there is a conversation that just seems to be dominating ICANN conversations right now, which is all about this DNS abuse. And it's something that I think it's a journey, not a destination. I think it's a constantly evolving space. But next slide, please. The challenge has been that registries and registrars, are called contracted parties, have worked very, very hard to address the things that they can. And there's a constant pressure to address things they can't, or that may not be appropriate, or that there are other solutions for. So in coming up with definitions of DNS abuse, contracted parties like registries and registrars, and in my case, I'm speaking as a registrar, we've worked very hard to identify things we can immediately address that are DNS-based, that there's not a lot of challenge to taking prompt and immediate action when we can. So it's phishing, farming, malware, botnets, and then a fifth, which is spam, when it's used as a delivery mechanism for the other four. But there's other types of DNS abuse, and depending on where you are in the ICANN community, perspectives vary on what should be considered DNS abuse. Now, the ones I described on the left are the ones that are really sort of outlined in contracts and agreements. But the challenge, and I'll note the challenge in a subsequent slide, as being something that attention and an ongoing sort of focus and even frictions exist. Next slide, please. So this is where I'm gonna come back to that same slide that talks about the Internet of Stuff. Let's talk about the governance of stuff. And I probably should have used lowercase g's on this rather than capitalizing this, because governed and governance, I think it means something different when you capitalize the G versus you do not capitalize the G, because it really does have a big change in the effect of that word when you capitalize the word governance. But I described all of those strata inside of the contracted party with respect to the registration system, and even the resolution system, that there's things that exist inside of the ICANN world in the left, and there's things that exist really outside of the ICANN world on the right, unless you start to focus in on the second N in ICANN, which is numbers, which historically has not been a lot of pressures to do that. Next slide. So there is no ICANN for hosting and content. And I made this in giant red bold print because this is probably the largest area of friction and challenge that seems to create, I think, grief, opportunity, friction, charged discussion, and opportunities for internet governance, is that many of the most problematic space, which is where things ultimately are hosted, there isn't any kind of overall governance for that outside of the areas where ICANN minimally overlaps. But because ICANN exists, people are trying to shove things that shouldn't be there into it, because there is a structure for that sort of global oversight. Next slide. So the domain registration and policy, there's a variety of different contracts that exist between a registrant and ICANN, which are in the center 4 regions there. So you see, this is a bit complex, but you'll see I have regulations and applicable laws are highlighted in red in the governance and policy authority. So those are things that happen outside of ICANN in the world of internet governance, beyond ICANN's shores. The things that are happening underneath ICANN, RY is short form for registry, RR is short form for registrar, and I spell out reseller. So the boxes below that are things that are contractual elements that help articulate policy and manifest into, agreements that exist between these parties. And then local law and national regulations are things that can affect the relationship between a registrant and a registry. And local law and regulations are always going to prevail in any of the cases of the things in between. Now, I keep saying that because no ICANN for hosting exists, that there's a lot of things that happen, and I use those red arrows as call out. So you end up with things related to, for example, privacy. So you have GDPR came out. Now, GDPR had a profound and cascading effect on the domain registration business because in order to comply with GDPR, it was necessary to make a sweeping number of changes, which prompted an immediate establishment of something called the temp spec, which affected WHOIS presentation and how that's how WHOIS is redacted. You'll also see where local law, is something that's applicable. So if, for example, a registrar is in a particular geography that has laws and how it's managed, that local law is going to be something that everything has to operate in accordance with. So next slide, please. So I know I covered a lot there, and I'm being mindful that there's probably going to be some questions that we may want to cover. So I want to go into something that's an important piece of the dialogue right now, that with respect to DNS abuse, because it's something that's going to help, I think, at least elevate awareness and education as to why it is that registries and registrars are focused in on this. So I want to talk about compromised domains versus malicious domains and some of the activity that we're working on currently. Could you go to the next slide, please, Glenn? So there's a dialogue about this, and it's an important conversation to have, and there is a significant difference. As I outlined, there's a tremendous number of the actual hosted problem space that exists in the area outside of what ICANN actually governs. And so we look at situations where affecting a domain name is very much like a giant switch that shuts everything off. And so we have to be very mindful before we do something that will affect someone, to make sure that we're doing that with as much elegance as possible. So if you have a domain that's compromised, let's say a person establishes a domain name and sets up I'll use WordPress as an example, and they don't keep up to date on their WordPress plugins. Some form of compromise allows someone to take over that WordPress installation, and somebody ends up hosting a bunch of malware on the domain's WordPress site. The registrant in that case, that's a compromise, and that registrant is a victim rather than a person who's actually attempting to perpetrate that crime. They're actually the victim of the person who's attempting to perpetrate a crime or whatever malicious activity. Now, a malicious situation is quite different. This is where somebody consciously chooses to register a domain name and do something bad. And those are very, very different scenarios. And they need to be split apart because handling them requires a difference in approach. So the other thing that there's constant pressure about is, for malicious registrations, somehow detecting these earlier than when somebody actually takes action and hosts something. And so we're constantly looking at ways to try and catch them as early as possible, but it's typically a reactive process because you really cannot read a registrant's mind and know how they're going to use a domain name. There may be some signals with respect to detecting credit card fraud or other attributes of the registrant that might trigger some sort of a sensitivity that we want to look at, but we really try to use care. If you think about it in the example of you walk into a store and you're there to shop, having somebody follow you around the store can make you feel really uncomfortable and choose you to shop elsewhere. And as I mentioned, it's a very competitive marketplace. You're really trying to not create so much protective friction that somebody's uncomfortable or doesn't want to start on their domain journey. Next slide. So I go into a little bit more detail with respect to compromised. This happens pretty frequently, unfortunately. And I would say the majority of the cases, the domain name is not hosted at the registrar. The DNS service may exist outside of the registrar for any ability to control, and the registrant is a victim. The only thing that we have as a registrar is to take the domain name out of DNS or change the name servers, which can disrupt things beyond just the affected website. It might cause, for example, all of the email to start failing. It may cause any other websites or other services that are hosted in DNS to be taken down. And so we really want to use this as a last resort. The other thing is once something is taken out of DNS at the registrar level, it can actually create disruption to the affected victim being able to recover and fix the problem of the compromised website. Maybe they just need to log in and run a backup restore and update a plugin and have their website back up and running, which might take 3 or 4 minutes. But if they have to somehow interact and engage and plead to get the domain name reactivated, that can be challenging, and it might not even be possible because their email's not working. So we truly try to be careful about the situation of a compromised host. Next slide, please. Malicious, this is somebody doing something intentional, but the difficulty we have, we want to take as prompt of action as possible for these because where that is a clear case, that's something that the earlier you prevent malicious activity, the less disruption effect or exposure that the internet has to that. It's a much better experience for everyone. But my mind reading capabilities are not strong, and it's very difficult to understand the intent of a registration. And the really good ones know how to disguise themselves as every other customer, so you can't tell until they actually activate a domain name. So that's a really challenging area, but we want to be able to take really prompt action, and taking something malicious out of DNS is something that many times is the most appropriate and best way to mitigate DNS abuse. So next slide, please.
Jothan, I do have a question. This is Alfredo.
Yes. Yeah.
So regarding what you just mentioned, what happens if I decide to as a registrar owner or merchandising it are outside of the DNS, sort of a Web3 tool or instance, what can be done in that case, if there is something that can be done?
Okay, so I'll repeat back to you what I think I heard. I think I heard where you might be selecting to use some naming system or identifier that doesn't exist in the ICANN space or registrar space, and you're
Right.
doing something abusive, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, there's not much a registrar can do, really, in that case, unless you'd acquired it through that registrar. But that's no different than you know, if you'd bought software or something that falls outside of again, ICANN's purview or the contract relationships. Can I park that and we can talk about it in the Q&A? Because I know the topic right now of Web3 names is something I wanted to leave some time if we did have some discussion time. But you know, I'd almost liken what your example is to like a Twitter handle or having some sort of a ability to work with a social media handle of some form. Is that okay, Alfredo? So this slide's really important because it's a case where we have to use care in how we handle abuse reports. There's a really challenging thing we have to face with is avoidance of friendly fire is what I call it. But I described earlier how expensive it can be to acquire a customer. It's super expensive to get a customer. It's really cheap to lose one. And the best way to lose a customer is to take down their website when they're trying to fix something or to affect things beyond a broken website in the process of addressing you know, their compromised site. We often get misdirected, duplicate, incomplete reports. I think, you know, folks, I talked a little bit about education being a hurdle and understanding, you know, what people can report to a registrar to help them take action. You know, sometimes somebody will just forward an email or just even fill out a form and say this domain is bad. But you really need to provide as much substance as possible to the registrar so they can take appropriate action or determine if that's right. There's also what I call abuse, where this can be, you know, sometimes a competitor might do this, or you might have a party who is on a has something that like some form of an axe to grind is, I don't know if that translates internationally, but some sort of a bias against a company and their policies may leverage or abuse an abuse reporting obligation in order to wear down or work through and exhaust the resources of a registrar or registry. And another very important thing is that abuse departments and registrars really work to be appropriate about exigent circumstances. So there are, or maybe things we can do in detecting malicious registrations if those are clear. But more than not, we're reacting to a report. And most registrars will work very quickly to deal with appropriate exigent circumstances where there's something that needs to be taken down rather promptly. So there is care in handling, I guess, is the most important piece here. But budget balance is part of doing the right thing. Next slide, please.
I think Bill has a quick intervention.
Oh,
Bill?
Bill, I see your hand. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. How big an impact is the internationalization of domain names going to have on all this? Because it can provide a fertile field for accidental issues. My favorite example is, suppose the city of San Jose, California, right next to Silicon Valley, sets himself up with a domain name of sanjose.gov. And then the capital of Costa Rica comes along and says, gee, we'd like sanjose.gov. And somebody says, well, no, that's taken. And they say, no, we, being Spanish speaking, will spell San Jose correctly with an accent over the E. And so that's a different letter. And the way the conflicting and blocked variants were set up, an E and an E with an accent are not in conflict. It would probably be rude to point out that the group that decided those things was overwhelmingly made up of people who work for domain GLD registries, but how much confusion there, and it isn't necessarily malicious, it's totally innocent in a lot of cases. How much additional problem for the abuse departments is that sort of thing going to cause? Thank you.
I love this question. Right, so there's a few different answers to that, and some of which exist in the technology, beyond registries and registrars. Some of it exists within. I'd say, first off, it's a case-by-case basis. I think in the example that you gave, one might more reasonably expect sanjose.gov or gov.cr, within the local respective CCTLD. I think there is a little bit of an example. .gov seems to be dominated by US government type of use. So, but I know you're just pulling an example of where the accent on the E or some other mark might be a factor. I'd say that this is something that ends up kind of falling into the category of homoglyph, where we certainly see, you gave two legitimate collisions that would be two perfectly legitimate users, but there are certainly circumstances where you have a legitimate site and you have an illegitimate site. An example is PayPal.com can be composed of a combination of Cyrillic and Latin characters that look visually to somebody looking at them as if they are, PayPal.com. And, if somebody puts up a website on something like that, they're able to, for all intents and purposes, to somebody who's not looking very closely, arrive at a website that looks like it's actually PayPal if you're not paying a lot of attention. So one of the things that the browsers do, I participate in, it was mentioned in something called the public suffix list. So I interact a lot with browsers, and browser safety is super important to many, many actors in the space. Some will take and expose certain combinations of character sets, such as Greek, Latin, Cyrillic, where there are visually similar characters. Rather than show PayPal, they'll show the XN-dash composition of the string. They'll expose that in the browser. So I think there's a combination within universal acceptance and the internet user world, the applications, browsers, et cetera, on how they'll expose or work with things to help make things a bit more safe. And then, how variants are handled is under current discussion within ICANN about this. And I think that, the visual example that you give, that's been happening frequently inside the cryptocurrency space. There was some compromises where some domain, very visually similar domains were provided, but they would have it would be an I with a very small change to the dot. So it would visually look like it was the same domain name. And folks, if they're not looking very close and click on something, I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is education to people about what they click or choose to interact with as websites. I hope I answered your question, Bill. I think it's a good question, and I think I think it had different layers to it. So I hope I parsed the layers out and provided you a good response to that.
Yeah, I've spent the last 6 or 7 years working on the whole IDN thing, so it's something near and dear to my heart. But I just thought it helps for someone taking this class to realize traditionally everything was done in English for historical reasons, but we're rapidly getting to the point where, you know, any of the hundreds of languages other than English and the scripts they're written in are going to become part of the whole domain name discussion. And as you say, it's a matter of intense interest within ICANN, but it's also going to become a matter of intense interest to registrants who never had it occur to them that you could get, for instance, .000 in because a circle is such an obvious symbol. You could get that in at least a half dozen different scripts. You know, that sort of thing can be a challenge to figure out, especially if for domestic education reasons, you haven't actually encountered other scripts before. So thank you for going into that.
Bill, we could do a whole session on IDN stuff, because the nuances are there. Now there's a variety of affectations. I know that there's a variance process underway, a discussion underway about, you know, how to handle variants. And I think there's things we say IDN, but, you know, the example you gave of San Jose, you know, with Costa Rica, I could imagine as a Costa Rican that I might want to see San Jose with and without the accent on the E, .gov.cr or .gov.cr. I'd have to look at which they use, but that you'd want both to behave identically. And
yes, especially because in Spanish, according to one of the folks that commented when the Latin Generation Panel put out its report, in Spanish, with and without the accent are considered interchangeable. And one of them is correct, but they're entirely accustomed to using them interchangeably. So yeah, you're right. They would probably want either to register both or at least to have one of them blocked, but probably, yeah, register them both. Of course, that has financial implications, and for city government, it's probably not a big deal, especially if they get it directly rather than in the resale market. But for a commercial organization, that could get real expensive real fast.
Well, Bill, there's implications beyond that too. I know we're deep diving into IDN, but it's nice to meet a fellow enthusiast. When you get out into the browser space, and I'm exposed to this a lot with some of the privacy efforts that are tied to the public suffix list, there's a further sort of consequence to this. If you think in terms of you know, the average user in Costa Rica, and let's say that the local folks do get both domains, whether they're assigned as a bundle by the registry that can be used together in common. The interesting part there is there's something evolving called first-party sets in the browser space outside of ICANN, and the first-party sets are some definitions that would occur within a web page that inform the browser that whether you have the tilde on the accent on the E or not, that please as cookies treat these both identically, so that your session logins will work across those. And that's something that .brands are looking at with respect to whether you go to blog.google or blog.google.com, that your session information should be identical, and you don't have to re-log in or log out or change things, that those two work sort of seamlessly. And it's a way that whether you're talking about IDN, where you've got multi-byte characters with tons of variants, and or English equivalents that a company, for example, that might interact with both traditional or simplified Chinese, that also have websites in English or in other languages. Imagine that the domains within that space could work in a harmonized way. There's things that can happen inside of cookies with first party sets, is what it's called, to help make that better. So there's things inside of universal acceptance, which is a super important area. And then there's things that happen beyond that. Both very super important areas. I could talk all day about this stuff because I'm a co-chair of the registrar tech ops, and I've actually chaired one of the first Latin panels for ICANN back in 2010, 11, somewhere around there. So it's, but IDN I've been involved in since the start back in the 90s. So I'm always glad to see that progressing. So it's nice to meet a fellow enthusiast.
And we could probably go on for several days on it if we both get going.
Right, exactly. Are there a lot of questions or any questions about sort of the registrar channel, the strata of the registrars, some of the things that we're discussing? I know Alfredo had asked about or wanted to talk about Web3 a little bit, and I'm glad to talk about that. I understand that quite a lot, all the different evolving space there. This is easy.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but please proceed. It's 5 minutes to the top of the hour, so you have 5 or so minutes to use whatever way you like, Jonathan.
Well, I mean, first off is gratitude, Glenn. What you're doing here with this, you and your colleagues are doing with this, is really remarkable and helpful globally, and so it's very important. And so thank you for the opportunity to participate in this and talk a little bit about this. I know I dove in, directly into some of the things that are going on with DNS abuse, some of the information about how the registration space is stratified. So I could dive into other areas, but I think this is, a quick bite and hopefully something that's helpful to your students with respect to learning this. I did list some contact information here. My LinkedIn address is there, my personal website, and information about the RRSG. If you have questions, I'm delighted to answer them, offline. And again, my gratitude to you for the opportunity to address today.
Well, we are the ones that are thanking you because this was a great session, and as Bill elaborated, there's so many points to touch on, and obviously Bill is very passionate on the IDN issue, and there is just for the benefit of everyone on the call, Universal Acceptance Day will be coming up, and we are reaching out to the First Nations in North America to be part, to push that. It's become same as the Maori in New Zealand. In the case of Canada, it is legal right for in some of our provinces. They actually have more obviously native speakers. So like, for example, in the far north and whatnot. But yeah, so there's been some real seminal movement. It seems in many ways on the IDN, it sort of was, in my impression, it was like a bit of window dressing, but it seems to get It's now seems to get some legs. Is this an attitude change, or is your community the ones that are pushing this? Like it seems to finally got some semblance of direction.
It's a big question. I mean, my personal opinion is that it's an evolution of the namespace that still has quite a long way to go, but it has a very passionate following and a belief that it will truly be transformative to people as we approach the extents of digitalization and the digital divide, that the next billion internet users probably are not English speakers and may have their own languages, cultures, and interests that could be better represented in the namespace. That's the belief. And that's, it's worth investing and leaning into the technology to ensure that they have a comfortable on-ramp and a familiar way to interact.
Great. Well, thank you again, Jothan. It's been a great opportunity, and unfortunately, Alfredo has a mushy internet connection because of it goes all the way back to Hurricane Maria. He has had challenges. So again, thank you so much, and we'll share the recording. And everybody, please complete the survey. Your feedback is most welcome. Again, Jonathan, I guess we'll see you in Cancun.
Yes, sir. Thank you again for the privilege. Appreciate it a lot.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining. This ends the session today. Thank you.